This is the Etiology podcast. I am your host, Elka Kubaku, licensed social worker and psychotherapist. In this podcast, we explore divisive issues around food, health, and body image with the goal of mending relationships within the eating disorder recovery professional community and creating a space where a multiplicity of perspectives can coexist harmoniously. This podcast is uncensored and encompasses the political and ideological spectrum. If you believe something you hear is harmful or misinformed, please be respectful to the speaker. And also, feel free to reach out about recording another episode on the same topic from your vantage point. My hope is that if, as professionals, we can hold each other's stories with respect and compassion, we'll be better able to do so for our clients.
It seems fairly obvious that there are many non-disordered ways of eating. Aside from food preferences and aversions, allergies, food sensitivities, body composition, our food choices can also be shaped by spiritual, cultural, and ethical values. In eating disorder treatment, this simple truth becomes much more complicated for two reasons. Firstly, because of the acuity and potential lethality of eating disorders, restoring weight and providing adequate nutrition takes priority over everything else. Secondly, eating disorder behaviors can be subtle and hard to recognize. It can be difficult to determine whether food related values are either masking or being mistaken for eating disorder behaviors. For example, our topic today, which is veganism. So, veganism can be used to justify food restriction, which can be deadly in certain eating disorders. And at the same time, ethical veganism is a legitimate belief system that exists outside of disordered eating. Decisions about how much to accommodate food related values and beliefs in treatment settings are practically, logistically, and clinically complex. But regardless of what decisions are made, the very least we can do is recognize the lived experience of the person in treatment and how conflicting values may impact them. In this episode, Maneva Gill shares her experience grappling with ethical veganism during eating disorder recovery, the internal conflict this created, and how she ultimately chose recovery. She reflects on what she wished her treatment providers had understood and speaks to the challenges of feeling torn between the social constructs associated with ethical veganism and the demands of recovery. Maneva is an eating disorder recovery coach based in California and certified through the Caroline Costin Institute. Her training focused on working collaboratively with treatment teams and supporting clients in making meaningful behavioral changes toward recovery. Her approach integrates the 8 keys to recovery alongside exposure and response prevention, health at every size, and her own lived experience of a full recovery. Before becoming a coach, Maneva worked for over 6 years in banking and financial technology and volunteered for 2 years as a peer support group leader and peer mentor with the National Association of Anorexia Nervosa and Associated Disorders. Her work is grounded in compassion, practicality, and hope through example. She offers fully online coaching and is available for in person and virtual speaking engagements. How do you feel about being here?
I'm excited. Thank you for having me join. Trying like a little bit out on a limb, but I think very worth it. Very worth it.
Tell me what you do in eating disorder recovery world.
I am a recovery coach certified through the Caroline Costin Institute. So a lot of my work is sort of like being the glue and the communicator on the team, especially for folks in outpatient. I check in with the team. I figure out what everybody's goals are, what, the client's goals are, the professional's goals are. And I work, sometimes it's once a week, sometimes it's a few times a week, or it's not always an hour. It's really like what the person needs and like what they need in between seeing the rest of their team for homework, for accountability. And it's not always me all support. It varies a lot. So that's what I work on.
Very cool and such a needed role. So you're filling the space in between. Somebody's in therapy mentally, or maybe they're stepping down from higher level of care, and they need someone who can be there with them by meals, or when you talk about exposure response prevention, help them maybe challenge some of the food rules or food aversions that they've had in ways that feel safe and supported.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot of my work. Challenging thoughts in a way that's compassionate, but like knowing how to like sometimes like it's some tough love, absolutely. And really it's like behavior change. Like that's at the core of like what I'm working on with people. So rather it's like what behaviors are we working on this week? This is another aspect of coaching is sometimes it's helpful for somebody who is working with a team already and committed and putting in the work, but they're trying to mitigate the likelihood of needing to go to a higher level of care. And so they're trying to fortify their outpatient team, with like reinforcing it with extra support. Nothing as a replacement, of course, but just as additional like layering. And also for people who are stepping down from more higher levels of care, rather that's like intensive outpatient or residential or things like that. And they're going into a more outpatient type of environment and looking for more support there. They can help reinforce what's been learned as like new behaviors, new coping strategies, and maintain that change as they go back to a day in and day out regular life things that have those triggers and those old things just kind of sitting there, you know.
There's a gap between higher levels of care and once a week therapy, and in many ways, you're helping to fill that gap.
Mhm. Yeah.
Tell me what's making you want to speak about veganism, eating disorders.
So it's something that I care about a lot from my own experience. So like professionally, I have, coaching certification. I would say like more at peer level, I've volunteered, led peer support groups, peer mentoring with ANAD. Personally, I have lived experience with the eating disorder and I've been fully recovered for about 7 years. And in my treatment, personally, like I didn't have a diagnosis until like I'd been experiencing the disorder for quite a while. And so when I did, I was like finally figure out what was going on in my life. I was very ready to commit to the process of treatment and to commit to my healing, just my story. And at that time, I noticed there was really a gap, not just on like the client side, but also on the professional side of support for people who were committed to treatment and yet going through some kind of curiosity or uncertainty with their values around like consuming animal foods, ethical veganism, and not just foods, but the whole like the total lifestyle component. And it was just a gap that like people didn't really know how to fill. And I think that like 7 or 8 years later, it's still, there's a gap there. And so I can't fill that gap at all, but I'm hoping to contribute something toward it that whether somebody's in treatment or they're considering, getting help, or it's someone who, is on the treatment side, that it's just maybe some more things that get to be shared that haven't been put out before, in a way that's like safe.
When you say in a way that's safe, the implication is that there's in a way that's dangerous or can be harmful as well. Can you speak to that? To what were some of your hesitations coming on here talking about this? And alongside what you're wanting to communicate, what you're not wanting to?
Yeah. So a lot of times with the conversation of veganism, even not in the context of eating disorders and recovery and treatment, even just a conversation around veganism on its own, but especially in the context that we're talking about it here, it can be a really controversial topic. It can be a topic that's very emotionally charged for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. Usually when there's a conversation about this, it's not just all vegans or all non-vegans or all people in treatment or all people not in treatment, like that are part of the conversation. And so like a lot can happen there. And I think that like what's important for this is like to have it be a space that when I say safe, I mean something that's useful, and serving a purpose for people to hear, but also that's less of that unnerving feeling that comes with it for people. And for me, like I'm coming from a place like I don't have a position on veganism and treatment or veganism and recovery. And when I'm talking about veganism on this show, I'm generally referring to what's called ethical veganism, which is about when somebody chooses to, abstain as much as practically possible from consuming animal products, animal byproducts for the sake of like animal welfare, ecological sustainability, even social justice, not veganism as a way of like being healthier, air quotes, or weight loss or a guise for certain disordered behaviors. That's not the veganism that I'm referring to here. And so I'm not saying like ethical veganism, I'm not saying it's possible or not possible for people in treatment, to maintain that and a commitment to recovery. Like and with people I work with, like I'm not the decider on that anyway, like that's not my role on the team. And I'm not recommending or promoting a certain way of eating. I'm not telling people like not to do it or to do it. I'm just kind of coming in and saying, hey, like it's not as much about like self-disclosure of like myself per se of like these details, but it's more of like what have I noticed that I think there's room for improvement, but like not blaming at all.
So, what you're touching on is a really huge question that a lot of people have, and it extends beyond veganism, I believe, where when people enter an eating disorder treatment center, oftentimes they're presenting with some type of restrictive eating. And there's so much in our society about restrictive dieting and health and controlling that health. And oftentimes people are coming in with a lot of anxiety around that. And at the same time, what you're describing is that eating is also so deeply tied to our values. And this is something that I think there is growing awareness around, that food is not just food, it's not just sustenance, it can be pleasure, it can be social experience. And what you're describing is it can be almost a kind of values system. And it's interesting to me because when you're talking about it, it almost reminds me of keeping kosher, which I keep kosher. And I have seen there's some degree of awareness around things when they're tied to a spiritual practice or belief system, when they're one that's very well acknowledged, but it sounds like veganism maybe doesn't have that type of acknowledgement just yet, or that type of understanding.
And I think there's also part of the thing that makes it tricky is like, I don't ever want to cause harm by talking about this. And I know that a lot of people who are on like the side of providing treatment, we're here like to help. We don't want to like say something that's going to be like, damaging for somebody or, something that's not going to be right. And so we don't know. The thing with like self disclosure and veganism is that it's like so linked together that there's not really room for people to have, or there hasn't seemed to be enough room for folks to have a conversation about veganism and treatment without there being an assumption of like an identification with that, like as part of a disclosure. Cause I think what's happening now is like, understandably, like the way we present things like has to be, supportive and helpful and like not harmful. But the thing with like not being able to say, there's no way for someone to say like I help out people who are trying to or curious or who are adhering to different components of veganism for ethical reasons. There's not like a phrase or a word for that. So people like just don't really know what to say, and so they don't say it, they don't list it on their specialties, they don't talk about it as much on podcasts, and it creates this unintended knowledge gap where professionals who know how to provide some kind of support or accountability at this crossroads that people find themselves in, it's an invisible specialty because like they know how to work with it to some extent or to a higher level of understanding, but it's invisible because they're not saying that. So on the client side, that invisible specialty then becomes an invisible support system. And people don't benefit from invisible support systems unless it's by accident. I also am not saying that like everybody saying everything that they think and feel and know or have experience with veganism and shouting all that from the rooftops is like the answer either. Because I don't think so. I really don't. I'm not saying that. It would be nice if there was the word like what I'm thinking of as vegan informed. And I'm pulling that from a book by Jen Friedman. I think she published that book in like 2022. It was about veganism and eating disorder recovery. It's a very good resource. Like it's a very good resource on all these things for like the more like treatment aspect of it and like the collective aspect of it. But when someone says like they're vegan informed, she has a whole framework for that. And I'm not going into like her framework necessarily, which is also very helpful. But I'm just looking to that now as like it's a kind of phrase that could be used in a situation where if someone could say that like they offer vegan informed care, that would be a way of like identifying like how they can help people without necessarily promoting something or saying that they stand for it. And then therefore having that gap of like, uh, someone just, went farther out, to do that. And then it's awkward. So like we had all these people who are professionals and they indicate that they specialize in treating substance use disorder, um, prenatal, postpartum, high level athletes, all of those experiences alongside eating disorders. And so but right now, like there's not really a way to talk about veganism in that same context. And so there's people in treatment who are very committed to treatment, very committed to healing, and not forgetting about the things that have nudged them toward ethical veganism in the first place, and without being able to know who's going to be the most helpful for them. They're making decisions and they're making trade-offs like still right now today that affect their health and their treatment and their recovery, their wellness, everything.
It feels as you're talking like you're tiptoeing between two extremes in the goal of not accidentally stepping into one of them. And on the one extreme, you have a very strong ideological veganism that it sounds like almost aims to convert. And I don't know that world so well, so tell me if I'm misunderstanding. But that's what I'm hearing, that there's an ethical veganism and this is true of many belief systems. And I think it's perhaps part of human nature. When we believe something so deeply, there's a part of us that's just like, let me share this with everyone. I just want you to see it, especially when it comes to hurting living beings. So on the one side, there's the ethical veganism that's like animals are living beings, and I just want everyone to know that and to take that into account. And I want to spread that to everyone who will take it in or will listen or maybe even won't listen. And then on the other side, you have the eating disorder recovery world, and oftentimes people who are coming from a place where they're very sensitive to messages around restricting food and might latch on to that as something to hold on to in ways that can be really counterproductive. So you're navigating that space where you're like, I see ethical veganism and I see what people stand for, and I see that as a legitimate value system for people. And I want to make space for people who hold that as a value system. And on the other hand, I see where it becomes really tricky with food restriction. And I want to hold that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that extreme that like if anybody's looked into veganism at all, like odds are good they've encountered that extreme, at some point, because there's a lot of that in the vegan community, whether it's in person or online, whether it's, emphasized more on the ecological aspect or the animal welfare aspect. There's a lot of that there. And the tricky thing with like, there's not really a bridge. Like that's where people in treatment struggle that are committed to recovery, is that there's not really a bridge of like, there's these two, big things, the recovery piece and the ethical veganism piece. And it's like, how do they navigate that without feeling like totally excluded from one and not the other? And so it's a crossroads that feels like to a lot of people like being between a rock and a hard place. And there's the idea with veganism when people think about whether it's dietary or non-dietary, like what is practically possible, because we don't live in a vegan world. Like the supply chain is not vegan, the stores aren't vegan, right? And so it's like there's choices and like there's skills to learn of like how to navigate that. And one of the things that comes up for people a lot with eating disorders is like all or nothing thinking, perfectionism, unrealistic standards, self-hatred. And so when you're approaching a question like what's practically possible from that place, people can be very hard on themselves. And I know that for a lot of folks, like making a total, lifestyle transition based on values, while at the same time staying committed to treatment and recovery, those two things together are often not practically possible. And a lot of times what we think about when we think of practically possible is like, well, where do I live in the world? And, what's financially like sustainable for me? Like what types of goods and supplies like do I have access to in stores? And what knowledge do I have about, how to put these different things together? But the commitment to healing and from an eating disorder is not something that really gets enough acknowledgement, like in that vegan world of like what's going on with what's practically possible here. Like you can only you can only take on like so many like things at once, just as far as like your time, your energy, your cognitive bandwidth, because all these things take energy. And so that's where it's been hard for people is like absolutely there's the extremism and like the desire of like total conversion, in a lot of the vegan community. That's, like I think honestly that's a bit like sad, to see because it creates that extreme and it creates the polarization. And also like that's kind of where it's left off. Like people struggle to find some way of like talking about it or engaging with it like without that level. And so for me, it's like I totally understand like people's like the importance of both of these things for a lot of people, because like I've navigated some of this myself. And yeah, it's a hard transition for folks. And I think if people, in recovery didn't feel the need to like embrace such extremism, like if there was a place in the vegan world that wasn't so extreme, I think it'd be better off for folks in treatment to like have exposure to that, and it'd be better off for, kind of like the vegan group as a whole, I think, to have like more gradient levels of like involvement and support and things like that and change.
Yeah. This has reminded me of so many conversations about religion. It's very interesting. And I know that was maybe not so much what you were coming in with, but that feeling like you're being forced to choose between the two. Either I'm forced to choose between this very extreme form of veganism or very maybe perfect form of veganism or my own recovery and my own well-being. And what you're wanting is to create a space between those two where you can hold that value system if it's something that's meaningful to you, and at the same time hold yourself and your own recovery process alongside that.
Mm. That's that gap. That's exactly it.
You've touched on having your own story around this. You've also touched on having some hesitations around sharing it and the fear that you'll be in some ways promoting something that maybe isn't right for everyone. Can you tell me in whatever way feels okay about your own exposure to this gap between ethical veganism and eating disorder treatment and what it's been like for you to navigate that?
Yeah. So I had, like I said, I'd struggled for a long time with the eating disorder before I got a diagnosis, committed to treatment, and went through my recovery process. So, like I said, I was very committed when it was like an opportunity to get help for that. And right around that time, I also became aware of like more of these things going on, regarding animal rights and not deep diving in that. There's other places on the internet to go find out about that. That's not where I'm taking this right now. But I had an awareness of both things at once of like, I'm learning more about this industry. I'd really rather not support what's happening there. And I'm also learning more about myself. And I have to change. I have to absolutely commit to change and change my life. And to like the recovery side of things, when I say change my life, like that's what I'm referring to. So on the one side, like treatment and recovery, they're like I said, the world's not vegan, treatment's not vegan. There's no guarantee of that, rather whatever level of care that you're in. And so of course there were choices I made to stay committed to my recovery that didn't necessarily line up with the choices I would want to make to pull back from that industry that I didn't agree with. And there were also times when I was seen by people on my team as like not taking my own recovery seriously or having some level of like non-compliance with the recommendations just because I wanted to bring this into the conversation somehow. Not because I was saying anything like, hey, I'm doing this or I'm going to do this or this is what's happening now in terms of veganism, but just because I was bringing it up and saying, hey, like all this stuff is overwhelming right now. And like, this is me being honest with you guys instead of hiding it, right? But that was still taken in a way that I was looking to sort of like dodge aspects of my own treatment. So even, I even had some people in my personal life say that, like put blame on the curiosity about ethical veganism for the whole eating disorder. And it's like, well, I've struggled with this for many years. And for like all the years leading up to my diagnosis, you couldn't blame, wanting to like unhook from the animal, consumption industry. You couldn't blame it for that. But now all of a sudden these two things are together. It's, veganism's fault, right? So there's like, there can be like a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of misjudgments from people who, are there to help, and even like, who are there really strongly presently in our personal lives. Then on the vegan community side of things, unfortunately, like the diet culture, the sizeism, the perfectionism, the unrealistic standards, all that has gotten its hooks into the vegan community, even like the ethical vegan community, just like it has pretty much everywhere else. And so now, like, I see it as something that, I feel sad about, right? Like looking at the big picture of what this means for everybody. But in a place of like recovery, that stuff's like very damaging, like very damaging. And that's why it's kind of like these things have been separate, because like that stuff is like so problematic for someone who's like committed or even like thinking about being committed to their recovery. And there's also a lot of judgment toward people who are not implementing in the vegan community. There's a lot of judgment towards people who are not implementing specifically the dietary component of veganism. And so again, like now I find that sad, but in the time of like recovery and treatment, really damaging, because here I am thinking, well, where can I go for support with both of these topics? And it's like they're both sitting on opposite sides of like this huge canyon, And so when when I'm like the person who's going through the recovery process of like, how do I pull this together? It's like I found myself sort of running back and forth between the communities to go, how can I take something that's helpful from this and take something that's helpful from that for the purpose of like my own healing, and like I wouldn't even say living by my values, but just learning how to figure out like what values fit and which ones didn't. And then, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, I'm listening.
In hindsight, like looking at this, then and now, because like with eating disorder, I too had perfectionism, all or nothing, thinking, unrealistic standards. And with time, like that's very different now. And I think the more time goes by, the more like savvy a lot of us are getting with like interpreting media and things like that. And what I realize is like the practically possible piece, nobody's 100%er out there. I've not met any people in the vegan community who are like 100% vegan, because that's not practically possible for most people, at least all the folks I've met. And when influencers or leaders are talking about like all the changes they've made, whether it's dietary or not, to unplug from the animal agriculture industry, they're talking about what's been practically possible for them. Like, as far as I'm aware, like nobody is putting this huge list on Instagram for all their followers to see of things that have not been practically possible for them to implement. Rather, not dietary. And that's something that I don't know, like people haven't mentioned it or like highlighted that, but I think it's worth mentioning.
Yeah. There are so many massive and really important things that you're touching on here. So you're in treatment center, you're really motivated. You're coming in wanting to get help. And then what happens for you is, and at the same time, you're sort of toying with this idea of veganism and understanding the ideology behind it. And some of it is landing for you. And what you're essentially being forced to do is to choose between one or the other. So whatever path you take, it's almost like you're forced to leave behind something of yourself and to lose some community. And that's such a painful place to be in.
And oops, I didn't realize I was muted. Okay, there we go. And also, for me, it's like instead of like choosing one or the other, like I did my best to build like which is going to be like the kindest thing I can do for myself right now. Like which is going to overall have the greatest like positive effect on my life, on the quality of my life. Um, like recovery for me definitely felt like the more urgent thing. I know that like that's not everybody's experience, but for me it definitely was. And so like I leaned more heavily on aligning myself with what was needed like in treatment than I did on like exploring a whole new value system. Cause like that's where I found myself being able to like hold on to each one a little bit. It wasn't like a 50-50. It wasn't like one or the other. It was like, I'm recovering, I'm in recovery. And I kind of kept a feeler out for that whole like, ethical conundrum. In hindsight too, like having more of an understanding on the support side of like how to help folks deal with like the all or nothing thinking, the cognitive distortions, that kind of thing. And looking back, another like these are like two more like kind of tangible examples of the gap that I found myself in. And I'm not saying I, did or didn't go through with either of these things, but they were things that were like topics of conversation. And I know that other folks have struggled with this too, is that in treatment and recovery, when the whole vegan awareness thing happens, if it does happen, if it happens at the same time where this conversation becomes relevant, the first thing is that there's an increased sense of overwhelm and other difficult emotions like anxiety, guilt, shame, all this kind of stuff that people go through if they're really like affected by what they're learning about in regards to like the animal agriculture industry. So if someone in treatment sees that and they go the direction of like making all these dietary and lifestyle changes, that's something that requires extra support, like not only from a nutritional standpoint, like with whoever's like, their RD on the team, that also requires more like psychological and emotional support. Again, like the therapist, because those are big changes to make. Like it's, learning how to feed yourself, nourish yourself, and manage your household in your life by, completely or as much as you can cutting out this what's for a lot of us a key ingredient and key ingredients. It's a whole new skill set to learn that. So following the decision, if somebody makes that decision, then it's a commitment to a whole new skill set, really. And that's again like that's not like an advertisement, that I usually see for that case. But in that case, it needs a lot more support from the team for someone to go through that. Similarly, if somebody is learning about the veganism piece and what it means for them, and like, they're kind of like rethinking certain things that they hadn't questioned before. And for whatever reason, they choose not to, or they're not able to, or their team recommends against it. And like they listen to their team, because like that's like, recovery. If someone doesn't or isn't able to change their consumption, dietary or not, to match like the big shift in values that's happening and they continue with how they, like what their consumption has been, that can also cause a lot of distress and upset for somebody. And in that case, like they still need extra support, not less, not ignoring it because we're all uncomfortable, but like finding a way to deliver like more support to that person. And in recovery, a lot of people, like myself included, I went through this. It's learning how to just understand your body cues. What is your body saying? Is it hungry, thirsty, tired, full? What food is it even asking for? Learning how to interpret those cues and then also like listening to them and like fulfilling them without like major like behavioral challenges and emotional challenges. So to change out a whole bunch of like routines, habits, supplies, recipes, social interactions out from underneath all that is like in a lot of cases, like I can't say for everyone, but in a lot of cases, like that's a lot. Like for a lot of people, it's like too much to ask of themselves. It's not realistic, not always. For some folks, depending on their support system, it can be. But all of the discomfort that can come with this needs coping skills. And eating disorders are already a place where a lot of people are struggling with finding healthy coping skills, with finding adequate coping skills. And the discomfort of healing already requires like us to lean on and leverage more of those healthy coping skills, whatever they are for us. And the discomfort of now what about veganism? That also requires more coping skills, not less. And so a lot of times the question for a lot of people comes down to, and this is a great question, like it's really important to ask people and I think it would have benefited me if there would have been more room for this specific question, like in my treatment plan, of to what extent are you like living by values by choosing to be vegan, and to what extent are you using veganism as a cover up for disordered behavior with food, disordered eating. For a lot of people, it's both. Like, it's not just one or the other, because a lot of people, when the whole like the lid comes off, like everything that's going on, like the animal agriculture industry, there really is a concern and care for a lot of people to see that. And at the same time, when you have the eating disorder, like it'll use anything. It'll use anything it can to like try to maintain its false self, you know? And so for a lot of people, it's both of those. But what happens in this gap that like we're here to talk about, that I came on to talk about, is that it's kind of like pushed into one corner or the other. Like people are kind of, it's usually both, but what gets emphasized is somebody saying, "Oh, it's just ethical. I don't really, I don't really care about it," and that's fine and true. But also, like, it's important to not like just kind of let things disordered be disordered that may have attached onto that, like to not let those things fester. And at the same time, if somebody says, I care about these issues, but I'm also like leaning on this a lot to um sort of like, not leaning on it, but like I find a lot of disorder just creeping into it, then it's like, okay, like let's work with that. But then to overlook where their personal values are coming in is like not doing them a favor either, because that's, rather it's veganism or religion or whatever, that's kind of starting to overlap with like the deeper healing that usually is taking place in recovery, and like recovering like the true self, like who you really are. So the gap is where it's like, is it about ethics or is it about hiding disordered behaviors? And a lot of times it's both, but the gap is that it only gets treated as one or the other or neither, when it's really both. And so that's where people are kind of left in the middle of going, it sometimes feels like one or the other in their team, but like specifically with like how it's being addressed in their team. Like it's not even like, are you adhering to this lifestyle or not? It's kind of like, sure, it's not ever really one reason for most people. It's not one reason. It's like not usually that simple. And so that's where people kind of struggle.
I love that. What you're talking about is being able to hold two conflicting truths at once. When you talk about the support needed to make this ideological shift and everything practical that it demands from your lifestyle, I imagine that for many people, they get that from the vegan community. But for you, because you are in eating disorder treatment and at the same time managing that and choosing to prioritize your health and well being, it must have been difficult to find that community that maybe is easier for someone who's purely on the side of veganism.
Yeah, and I looked, through my own eating disorder healing and through life after that, I looked at, I tried to find books, blogs, podcasts, YouTube videos. I looked for the middle ground. I thought, well, if I'm not finding some middle ground in the vegan world or in the treatment world, like maybe it's somewhere else. Like maybe I'll find it through like trying to do research online. And the book I mentioned about eating disorders from Jem Friedman, that didn't come out until 2022. So that only came out 3 years ago. So at the time when I went through this, there were no books. So when you're not looking at books, it's like, who wrote this? Who published this? Like, what was their motive? Like, it's not as clearly laid out. It takes some more digging. I could almost equate it, like, to give like a more general example, I could almost equate it to like, there's a lot of diet culture and sizeism in the general health and wellness field. And so whether you're like in treatment or like maybe you're recovered or in recovery, we like we pick up on that. Like I can sense when like I go into like, whether it's an acupuncture practice or a new doctor, like I can sense if something is like, I know if there's BS, like I can pick up on it really easily. But and that's there in the vegan world too. And so it's kind of like interpreting everything through a filter. It's like there's no place to go for just like information that's like just designed to be helpful for the middle ground. Instead, it's like putting on a filter and going, okay, so what's diet culture? Okay, I don't need that. Okay, so like what's restrictive? I don't need that. What's perfectionism? I don't need that. So rather we're like going clothes shopping, doctor shopping, or like looking for a place in the vegan community that's not so extreme. It's like a lot of discernment, a lot of discernment over and over again, which can be taxing. Like even if like you don't have an eating disorder, like it gets old doing like so, but it's was necessary for me to do when looking around at like where is the common ground, like because they're not totally opposed to each other either for a lot of people. A part of them that wants to pull back from supporting the animal agriculture industry, they want to reduce suffering on some level. Oftentimes for people, not always, but oftentimes that part is also the part of them that wants to heal themselves and wants to give themselves the best life that they can live and really nurture themselves and take care of themselves. And so the outer realities of like what gets put out on social media and like what kinds of things are acceptable to have or even talk about in treatment, just like aside from all that, like on a deeper level, like sometimes there can be like a lot more overlap that could be like, even if it's not like leverage, just to have it like be understood, that I think could help people like get through the gap. And that topic didn't come to me in my treatment. Like I started to find it like years later. I'm going, wow, this would have been a great topic. This would have been really good, whether it's ethical or disordered or both. Like it's another way, it's another angle to I think help ground people and sorting through all this stuff.
Yeah. You were navigating such uncharted territory. It's sort of wild to me that literally nothing came up when you looked that up.
Sometimes it's that nothing came up, and sometimes it was that something came up with a title that made it sound like a middle ground, but it was really all one way. Like it was one or the other. It was a title that said, okay, like we're going to talk about both these things on this podcast or this, blog or whatnot. And then it was not the middle, it was on the edge again, So I found a lot of resources saying like, it's totally not possible or practical at all for someone to have such a focus on like this, much less like working with the dietary component in treatment, and I found all this other stuff too about like in the vegan world, the extremes of like, if you don't change your whole life overnight, then you're a bad person. It's like that being the other like extreme. And I'm paraphrasing both pretty roughly, but that's really like what I found. And so of course I found things, but I didn't find things that filled the gap. I just found a bunch of stuff that didn't really say any more than what I already heard as far as like getting to a middle ground. The one thing that was available then as like something that was helpful and people knew that they could say without getting in trouble or starting like, some big uncomfortable thing was this idea that if you want to implement any aspect of veganism for the sake of reducing suffering of living beings, then consider that you are also a living being and don't do it in a way that causes you suffering because that's counterproductive. And that's totally true. Like that's a useful thing that is like a really it's eye-opening and like probably no one's going to be in hot water for saying that. But even with that, that didn't bridge the gap between two worlds. Like that's a great piece of wisdom, but it did bridge the whole gap. So that's pretty much all I found. And there's certain people out there there's very few people out there who are saying like they're a therapist or a dietitian for eating disorders and they're saying like they are vegan. They are ethically vegan. There's some folks out there, but like that wasn't like my treatment team. And I just decided like for me, like this was my navigation of it is like it's better for me to work with what's right here. I don't need to go shopping around for some ideological like group of people, like everyone here is like on board for supporting me and like we're all committed. So it's like it didn't seem worth it at all or practical at all to like rock that boat. But the only people that are talking about veganism and treatment as providers are folks that I've seen who are like saying they are vegan, not people that are saying that they can support it because someone could say they're vegan informed, and that might mean that they're vegan. That might mean that they used to be vegan or vegetarian. It could mean they have a loved one who's is or was vegetarian or vegan. It could mean that they took a course about, I don't think there's that many courses out there about this because there's not even that many conversations, but maybe they took a course about a few of these things. Maybe they worked at a residential center that had like a vegan option of like, treatment and meals and all that. So some way they've had exposure. But yeah, so there was no way to like identify even aside from looking for a certain kind of, provider practitioner. There was no way to even like know who would have a blog about this or a video about this that would be useful and like not doing harm just to like take it in, because they're not really indicating that, in what they offer. Even if they know this dilemma very well, it's like hard for some folks to find a way to share in a way that bridges that gap.
There's something that makes it really unspeakable. And you've started to name that before. Can you talk more about what do you think was the reason why, when you're looking it up, the only resources you can find are ones that pull you toward one extreme or the other, or give somewhat of a more superficial way of smoothing over one or the other? What do you think that is that makes it so difficult for people like you to speak up?
Well, what is it that makes it difficult for folks like me to speak up on this? Or what is it that makes it difficult for people in treatment to like find resources like about what we're talking about?
I think the two go together, but let's start with what is it that makes it so difficult for folks like you to speak up? And I think that probably leads directly into what makes it so difficult for it to permeate the more mainstream treatment center world.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So for me, like the speaking up piece is that it goes back to uncharted territory of there's not really anybody that I'm aware of in the eating disorder field talking about how they have any like allowance or tolerance or informedness about this, and who are also at the same time not promoting something in a way that there's like usually a spoken or an unspoken agreement or a code of conduct for a lot of our licenses or certifications and credentials that like we don't disclose these things because it's a protective layer for a lot of the people who we serve. So it's kind of like, don't go there, right? You know, usually people have some kind of passion or care or concern about this because they've been in that gap where it's just the void, And so I don't really see a lot of people who are able to come out and say, hey, I'm familiar with this. I can help out with this. Not like to some universal standard, of competency, but just like, hey, I'm aware of it. I'm not going to make a snap judgment either way. And it's something that will have room to talk about, and we'll let it take up the space that it needs to be part of your recovery, like not part of your anxiety, without saying that it's part of their life. A lot of people are out as like, this is part of my life and who I am and what I stand for. And there's a lot more people who are recovered vegans or who are vegan professionals rather, or not they're recovered. And they're just not saying like anything, like on a public level, on a marketing level, but in through life, like I know these people. So I see folks that are saying like, hey, this is me, who I am and what I stand for, or folks saying nothing. And so it's kind of like, what are the guidelines for saying I'm willing and able to have a conversation with this about my clients. I'm willing and able to explore it with them without canceling things out, and also without enabling certain self-destructive behaviors, without like identifying myself, rather or not I am, like whatever my values are, like not bringing my values into it personally as like an example or anything like that that people would try to like compare to or use as justification like for certain things. It's kind of like how to share this as a specialty and say, hey, like, I don't have the answer to this gap that you're in, but I at least understand the gap that you're in. And it's not about me. Like how to say that, that's something that I haven't seen be said before. So that's kind of like where I get a little bit tripped up of like, where do I share this? How do I share it? Is it worth it? And of course, it's like, it's worth it. It's almost like somebody has to go first. And I don't know who else is out there talking about this. So I'm not even saying that I am going first. There's probably people who've found ways to start bringing this out. And I would love to like see like how they're doing and like see what they're doing and like connect with other people who are filling this gap. But at the same time, in my world, with all the books I've read, the podcast I've listened to, the networking things that I've gone to, the YouTube videos I've, found, I don't know anyone who's out there saying, I work with this, but I'm not saying it's about me and my identity. So like I'm kind of the first person that I know in my world to do this. And so there's no template for it. There's no template for like exactly how to do that. But
Yeah.
if nobody does it, if nobody like breaks through and says, I'm only going out on a limb because I care, like not really to assert myself, but just because like I care and I want this gap to not be so huge. If people don't start doing that, like there just has to be some momentum like to get it started. And I'm sure I'm not doing this perfectly, right? Like I'm not doing it like to some like template standard, but it just takes some more people finding ways to do this to know like how to really do it. So I'm probably not the only person who's in that uncertainty. I'm the only person I know who's talking about it on a podcast. That's for sure. And I think that might be what also, like you said, that then informs like why is it so hard to find information about this? I think it comes from that.
It's so powerful and valuable to be able to not know. To be able to say, I hold these two different truths, and I don't need a nice sentence that pulls them together, but I can hold you in the process of finding what that is for you. So the fear around speaking up, one is that it just hasn't been done before. And there's the fear of being the first to do something is that you'll be almost leaving everybody else behind or stepping away from the group that you're a part of, which in this case is the certified eating disorder recovery coaching, which I've heard you say you're finding ways of navigating. So that's one piece of the fear. And the other piece is, and this is true, I feel like in the eating disorder recovery world at large, is there's a lot of fear and justified fear around promoting any type of food restriction. Because for those of us with eating disorders or who have recovered, who have a tendency toward all or nothing thinking around food that can so easily translate into if I'm doing this, I need to do it 100%, or if I'm doing this, I need to do it at the expense of my own health or well-being. What I will often see, and you mentioned like diet culture as another example, and the health and wellness industry where people might feel like they're pulled between two things. And what I'll often see people happening for people is when they're pulled between two different things that feel very central to who they are, there's almost an internal polarization where they will maybe alternate between one or the other. So I'll see someone who, let's say, has been told that they need to lose weight by a medical professional, and then they're in eating disorder treatment where they're told weight loss is not an option. So they're maybe more aligned with eating disorder treatment, but then here and there, the weight loss piece will come up. And because it's hasn't really been addressed, it's just been made unspeakable, it will come up with the full intensity of like, I need to do this full force. Um, it sounds like for you, you were able to choose eating disorder treatment. To what extent, if at all, did you experience that internal polarization? Or were there times when the vegan piece came up within that, or was it sort of mostly kept silent throughout your treatment?
I mostly kept silent because what I realized pretty quickly is that, first of all, talking about it didn't really result in being supported for it or supported through it. And sometimes talking about it got to a place of, like I said, people thinking that I wasn't taking my treatment seriously. And by then I was like so committed to healing that it's like, well, if this curiosity of like, I learned all these things, how do I filter that into like how I'm living my life, with like the vegan piece. If my curiosity to that is either, causing people to think that I'm not taking treatment seriously, then it becomes like I am on my own trying to address the shortcomings of like two whole industries or two whole fields while I myself am the one who's trying to actually receive benefit from them. So for me, I just went more silent with it through recovery because I'm here, like the way I looked at it was like making changes in what I consume for the sake of reducing suffering. Like that choice is always going to be there for me to whatever level it's possible. Like right now, it doesn't really seem practical, but that choice is there. Like it's available. It's not going to expire. And looking at my life, it's like at that time, treatment is happening now. Like I can't say that treatment or recovery or healing or a certain quality of life will just always be an option that's there for me. And so it's like this is like the seize the moment thing of like right now. At that time, it's like, hey, at the time I have insurance. At the time I had diagnosis. At the time I had a treatment team. And that's not something that's like to be taken for granted. That's not something that's like always going to be there, whether it's me or someone else. Like those things come and go. And so I thought this is the more elusive of the two. Like veganism's not going anywhere, but like my time, like veganism as a whole, like the whole system, the whole culture, the whole community, that's like always going to be there. For me, it was like, I can't always say that I'll have the resources to do this big healing work. So right now, that just takes precedence.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean like abandoning necessarily the other, but definitely like prioritizing the recovery.
You were able to set aside the urgency with veganism and to just be able to say, this is there and I still care about it. And it's not for right now.
What could have been more helpful, not just for me, but like it's not just me, right? So even though it's my experience, like I think it could be more helpful if people in the treatment world could and I try, like I try in my work to do this, and I'm not saying like it's easy because like we all don't want to say the wrong thing. And it's not just like my certification. Like I know like other people that are therapists and coaches, rather it's where their workplace, like not necessarily where they go to graduate school, but it's like where do they work, or like what organizations are they a part of, and what limitations do those systems have on what they can share or say that they talk about. Like how I think it's helpful if people on the treatment side can role model or at least like have an inquiry about like what does it mean to look at something like veganism without the all or nothing thinking, without the unrealistic standards, without the perfectionism. Because when we're talking about helping people out, it's like it's almost like, sometimes people say to me in coaching, or like, oh, like I had lunch, so I don't, deserve to eat dinner. I haven't earned it. And I can say to them, well, what would you say to a friend who says that to you? That's like bringing out like their poor self, their healthy self. And usually they can say something nicer, like much more nicer and realistic to their friend if they were saying it to their friend. The thing with veganism is like, I haven't seen people really entertain that at all in treatment, like in my experience with it, I've heard of. Like, if somebody says, oh, I just learned all these things about the animal industry and now I want to like change my whole life overnight and I'm in treatment, people go, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I understand the whoa. Okay, like I understand that. But nobody's really saying, like, hey, so that thing of like, if your friend went through this, would you expect your friend to like go through all these changes and put all this pressure on themselves and just keep going along in recovery and like they change their whole life, no big deal? And like, no, like there's more room for people to say like these parts of veganism, whether it's dietary or non-dietary, these parts might be realistic for you right now. And that might often be non-dietary in treatment. And if it is dietary, rather someone's making that call on their own or talking to other people, like I really hope there's like specific nutritional support as part of that decision. It's not like as much as it can be hard for people to talk about these things with their team, it's really something that it needs the support of the team. So it's hard to like, it kind of takes the team as a whole, I think, for maximum effectiveness to look at like what is practical, what is reasonable, what's not all or nothing. Not even like trying to like support that person in taking on parts of veganism, but to support that person in like evaluating it, to be like, it's another inroad for a therapist or a coach or a dietitian to sort of like challenge thoughts, change behaviors, and find new coping skills and find ways of getting someone to think about like, well, what's realistic? What's possible? What's not possible? What's, maybe something that could be possible in 3 months? Like, how can I know that something's not right for me right now? How can I know that something is not advisable, besides obviously asking your team, but like teaching people how to start understanding these things on their own? I think there's like, it's not just the gap that clients find themselves in, but there's also an opportunity, sometimes a missed opportunity, but not always, for people providing treatment to like use this as a way like to connect with the person and also to build skills and like help them. It's like a life skill, like figuring out, do I believe in this? Is this for me or not? Is this who I am or not? The client doesn't have to know what the therapist is with that, where the coach or dietitian is with that, for that person to help them like start parsing it out. That's helpful.
Yeah. What you're advocating for is to enter a person's world and to be able to help them both understand what their own value system is and also navigate the gray space within that. And those are important skills.
And there was some thought I had too that kind of helped me lean more toward recovery than an ideology, was that nothing that I'm embracing as an ideal or as a value, none of what I'm embracing from that place should ever stand in the way of like healing from eating disorder. Like nothing that I would really like subscribe to, on any level. Like I don't mean email subscribe, but I mean like in life, like I don't want to be holding on to something that's going to stop me from recovery. I was more willing to hold on to certain things that took some effort and thought and involvement from my team, even if it was like odd for them, to figure out, how does this fit into my life? Can it fit into my life? But I was not personally stuck on trying to hold on to something that was actually stopping me from healing at the same time. Like that was where I personally drew the line of like, I'm not carrying things that are stopping me from really getting the benefits of treatment. But if something can tag along with that, and I might have to do like some trial and error, to know that. And that also, like, for people listening to this on the treatment side, like that means being really honest with your team. It's not like if someone on our team says, well, you could try implementing this and see how it goes. That's not a forever, green light. It's like, pay attention to what happens when you make changes. Pay attention to like what happens in your thoughts and your feelings and your body, and tell your team about it, whether it's about veganism or not, dietary or not. Because even if someone's like starts volunteering more with like animal shelters as a non-dietary component, like it can bring up more stress. It can also bring up more satisfaction and fulfillment. And like all those are opportunities for emotional processing and emotional regulation, even like identifying emotions. And sometimes it just needs more support. But that's something that I leaned on, was like, if it stopped me from recovering, like, sorry, I've got to let it go. I can't hang on to those things and be committed at the same time.
Yeah. In the absence of guidelines outside yourself, you almost created your own ways of evaluating for yourself. Is this helpful or harmful? Is it time for this or not? Very cool.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I just said very cool.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot to go through. And like I went through that, like I made it through, and I realized, and it was like a constant reevaluation too, because a lot changes in treatment, a lot changes in a healing process, and in coming to terms with like new information that totally changes your mind about things. Like it's always changing. And even though, yeah, I made up a structure in the total absence of a structure, that would be helpful. There's helpful parts of the recovery side. There's helpful parts of the vegan side, but that middle ground, there's not a structure. And it's like you said, I made my own. And it was really difficult to like do that. And I think there's so much room for, I didn't always get it right. Okay. Like without even trying to recall any detail from it. I know I didn't always get it right. I just did the best I could. And that's why for me, it's worth like going out on this limb because people shouldn't have to do that. And, it's an unfortunate reality of like what's not, figured out yet as far as treatment and holding, different kinds of ethics in consideration for like the recovery piece and everything. But it's something where there's a lot of room for things to go wrong. I wouldn't like romanticize it or glorify it at all. Like, yes, I made it through that, and thank goodness, right? But there's just so much room. Like everything was uncharted. And again, like it's an invisible specialty. It's an invisible support system. And until now, for me, it's been an invisible story because of that whole complex, the whole like invisible aspect of it. And so it's like, I think it's really high risk for everybody to let that stay the same. I know like it might be like this is like parts of this have been uncomfortable maybe for like either of us and a listener, like who knows, right? But going through a huge uncharted territory in recovery from, eating disorders are serious, right? Like all the statistics, all that stuff. Being in such uncharted territory in that healing process is like high risk, like whatever your level of care is or whatever. I personally lean more toward the recovery side, but not everybody does. Like some people lean more toward like the ideological side. And without any like guidance, it's like you just don't really know how that's going to affect somebody's healing and their safety and their wellness. And so it's kind of like not worth letting it continue as it is in this like invisible way. It sort of like has to have, I kind of feel like the whistleblower a little bit, not like in a huge sense, but just like in a way of like, there's this thing that people are being left to figure out by themselves. And it's like you wouldn't let somebody figure out, like if someone's in intensive outpatient, you're not going to go say, well, good luck with your meal plan, figure it out by yourself. Or like, good luck with your emotions, go figure it out by yourself. But what's happening through, things that are meant to like protect us, there's this knowledge gap that's basically saying, well, you've got this huge back and forth thing with like this ideology and you're healing, good luck figuring it out. And no one's actually saying that. No one person is actually saying that. Everyone that I've talked to about this like really cares and just doesn't know like what to do differently. So like nobody's the bad guy here at all. It's just there's like this deficit where the effect ends up being like good luck with this huge piece of recovery. Like really it's kind of like good luck. And like now we know that like everybody gets a little bit different search results on certain things based on like algorithms or paid marketing or whatever. And so it's like it takes a lot to like do this kind of research on your own. And there's no guarantee that you're going to find anything. And so it's like a lot of people are investing in like treatment and professionals and support and they're still not getting this. And it's not like anybody's fault, like we're just trying to find like a new way to meet a need that hasn't been as obvious before as it is now. And even if veganism is just a fad, even if ethical veganism is just like a trend, as I've heard some folks say, it's not gone yet. And there's people who are still at this crossroads. And like, that's the reality right now. So that's why I've, kind of gone out on this limb, like I said.
Yeah, I can hear some sadness in your voice even when you talk about being so alone in like all these conflicting thoughts and feelings and having to navigate that yourself. And I hope that the next person who's trying to do veganism in recovery will hear your story and maybe feel a little less alone. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me and taking the deep dive today.
Yeah, good.